Excellent. So again, welcome everyone to Unveiling Queer Archives, Narratives, Legacies, and Histories. Oh, Donatella is joining us. We're thrilled to have everyone here together virtually for this session. If you're here as an audience member, you are very welcome. And this session, I want to note, is sponsored by the LGBTQ focus group as well. So my name is Ben Gillespie. My pronouns are he, him. I'm doctoral lecturer in communication, gender studies, and theater at Baruch College CUNY, co-editor of the Journal of American Drama and Theater, and a member at large of ATHE's LGBTQ focus group. And I'll just allow my co-facilitators, Bess and Kel, to introduce themselves as well.
Hi, I'm Kelly Aliano. I go by Kel, use she, her pronouns. I'm an adjunct in the English department at LaGuardia Community College, and I'm the manager of education special projects at the New York Historical Society. And for this year and next year, I serve as the member at large for focus group representatives on ATHE's Governing Council.
Hey everyone, I'm Bess Rowan. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an assistant professor of theater and affiliate faculty in gender and women's studies and Irish studies at Villanova University. I am proudly the LGBTQ plus focus group representative and the newly elected vice president for membership and marketing at ATHE. I am the co-editor of the Journal of American Drama and Theater alongside Benjamin Gillespie. And I'm currently coming to you from Ireland, which hopefully will be okay internet-wise, but just a heads up on that.
All right, thank you. So in this session, we will delve, and everyone else will have a chance to introduce themselves when we get to your portion of the presentation. So in the session, we will delve into the complexities of unveiling and preserving the queer past through various archives, including the performed archive. Our exploration will encompass the narratives that shape our identity, the construction of queer legacies in theater and performance histories, and the pivotal role that archives play in theaters, museums, embodied memory, and contemporary society more broadly. We know that this is going to be a rich and inclusive dialogue that seeks to unravel the layers of the LGBTQ plus past, understand the complexities of queer legacy and kinship, and redefine the role of archives in shaping the present and future of theater, performance, and society. And now I'll pass it on to Kel.
So this roundtable aims to address a number of key questions. What constitutes a queer archive and how should it be curated? How do we effectively tell the stories of the queer past? What is the significance of creating a legacy through archival narratives? What role should archives play in preserving and presenting these stories? How do we see queer time and queer failure playing into the construction of the queer archive? And finally, how do time and the archive impact the memory and legacy of artists or writers whose work spans over multiple decades? Examining the unique value of individual stories within the broader historical context, we collectively seek to challenge the imperative toward historical linearity in favor of acknowledging the diverse perspectives available within queer narratives and intergenerational community exchange for LGBTQ plus people. We also explore the role of education and pedagogy within the framing of queer narratives, legacies, and histories. Bess?
This session takes the form of a virtual roundtable discussion. Our panelists have already engaged in conversation prior to our meeting today within designated subgroups. One of those subgroups focused more on individual archives of specific artists or writers, while the other focused on more general archives with multiple voices. We will begin by hearing from each of our participants for roughly 3 to 5 minutes each. Each panelist will briefly introduce themselves and give a share out on the archive they are working on, as well as how their work addresses issues surrounding queer archives in general. This will take up the majority of our session. And Ben's about to share our speaker order so that you all see in the chat, which he just did. Thank you, Ben.
Maya, I hope that you're okay going first. It was randomized. So are you okay with that? Are you okay?
I am okay to be first.
Okay. So before we, so Bess, you just have just the, well, I'll just say it. So following the share outs.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So it'll take about 60 minutes because we have 12 people sharing out. We'll split into subgroup conversations in 2 breakout rooms for about 15 to 20 minutes to further the pre-conference discussions, as well as expand on those discussions today. And audience members at that point can feel free to join either of the 2 groups. So we'll kind of summarize those things later. And then we'll come back.
How you do that,
sorry,
and how you do that is you'll message me to tell me which group you'd like to join, and I will take care of that for you.
Excellent. So does anyone have any questions or clarifications before we jump into our first presentation today? Okay. All right. So Maya, I think you should have access to share your screen.
Okay, I've tried to be about 5 minutes putting this together. Let me go and share my screen.
Great. And just as a reminder, we'll time everyone, and Kel will send a message to you through the chat function, just letting you know once you've reached 4 minutes so that you know you have about a minute left. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so I am Maya Cantu. I use the pronoun she, her, hers. I teach on the drama faculty at Bennington College. Make sure this moves. And I'm briefly talking about the research process that went into my recently published book, Grease Paint Puritan, Boston to 42nd Street in the Queer Backstage Novels of Bradford Rope. So very briefly, the book and the research that went into it follows the life and work of Ropes, the Mayflower Pilgrim descended author of the bawdy 1932 novel 42nd Street, on which the classic well-known film and stage adaptations are based. And a little bit more about Ropes's work. He was the author of an early 1930s, I call it his backstage trilogy, that really placed a sustained focus on the lives and relationships of gay men as focused on the central figure of the chorus boy. So that's a little bit about Ropes and his work. So I focused on 2 of the kind of big questions we were all collectively looking at in what constitutes a queer archive and how should it be curated, and what role should archives play in preserving and presenting these stories. So I could go on for a very long time about the specifics of this particular research process, but more or less, it took 5 years, kind of still going in some ways, working without a centralized collection of papers. So this was an exciting and challenging project, and I encountered the necessity of really navigating across multiple archives, often achronologically, and across many different sorts of forms and media. So I started, in his hometown of Quincy, Massachusetts, just outside Boston at the Thomas Crane Public Library, using microfiche research. And then I was unlocking certain things like his stage name. I was then able to expand into digital archives in both English and French. He spent a year or 2 in France performing under his stage name. Genealogical databases such as Ancestry.com, acquiring a few items on eBay, further library archives, kind of more traditional institutional archival methods. And then I was lucky enough to locate a relative. And so it kind of went into oral history as well. So the big, one of the huge things about the process is, as much as I was able to find, just so much absence in the archive, and questions on what to do with what was missing in the Ropes narrative. I found many interviews, so I was able to bring his voice to life that way, but I was only able to acquire one piece of personal correspondence, which was a letter he wrote to a gossip columnist, either Jimmy Starr or Jimmy Fiddler, about sponsoring an opera company. So I was able to find only one piece of personal correspondence, which in a project so biographically oriented, it's kind of, rare to have so little personal correspondence. So kind of accepting absence. So I was thinking, I think, as many of us might be, about queer failure and the queer art of failure after Munoz and Halberstam's ideas on queer failure, and kind of coming around to accept that there was going to be quite a bit of absence in the archive, in part because Ropes, I think, did live his life, in a way that was very authentic to him, but that did involve this kind of idea, this modality of being off script, off page, some ideas of personal discretion, and I very much in line with, I think, ideas of queer failure and kind of accepting that as being at the center of the process. So I looked to find kind of other ways to bring presence, my own embodied presence as researcher into this queer archive through different kinds of experiential research. So, you know, I didn't necessarily have this path set out when I started, but I found myself at, you know, Ropes's childhood home where he grew up in Quincy, Massachusetts, in his, you know, schoolroom at the Thayer Academy, where he, you know, cultivated his love of theater and performing. It took me to graveyards and columbariums, and I eventually found the gravesite of his entire family, but he wasn't there, you know, which is kind of maybe metaphoric of my process and the kind of role of absence within it. So to wrap this up, this brings me to kind of two final questions that we talked about as well in my subgroup. I think we all kind of identified, you know, questions about absence and thinking about the relationship of absence to queer archival practice. And another question that I started to, you know, kind of consider in thinking back on my research process is, to what extent did archival absence and erasure queer my own research process on Grease Paint Puritan? Because as much as I was able to go to traditional institutional research methods at the New York Public Library, the Morgan Library, you know, there's also a kind of different relationship to the archive when you're outside of somebody's childhood home, looking up at the, you know, bedroom window where they were probably reading Shakespeare. And, you know, it was a very kind of different process I had with this research process on Ropes and navigating the complexities of his queer archive. So I will end it there and stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya, for starting us off. That was wonderful. And well, I'm going to try and keep, and I'm sure Bess and Kel as well, we'll try and keep track of some of these questions that come up in each of your presentations and maybe try to return back to them, especially about absence, you know, in your presentation, Maya. Thank you. So next up, we have Jim Wilson.
Great, thank you. Okay. All right, I've written mine out to keep in the 5 minutes, but my name is James Wilson. I use the he, him, his pronouns, and I am the executive officer of the Theater and Performance Program at the Graduate Center. When I read the announcement that Charles Busch is to be inducted into the American Theater Hall of Fame, I dashed off a congratulatory note. He responded almost instantly, writing, "Thank you, James. I never thought they would come around to me. When I received an email from the Hall of Fame via my website notifying me of my induction, I immediately called my closest friend, Kathy, who also handles all of my internet and computer issues. After I told her the big news, she said, 'What's the email address? It might be a scam.' I guess it wasn't. I'm so thrilled and moved and everything. Charles." Apparently, the "You've been inducted into the Theater Hall of Fame" con is the showbiz equivalent of the ubiquitous "congratulations, you won a free cruise" sham. Anyway, I've been thinking about Charles Busch's legacy a lot lately, and in particular, the extraordinary success of Cole Escola's "O Mary" has drawn me back into Busch's archive. As a longtime Busch fan, and I recently admitted to him that I'm more stalker than fan, I have developed my own memorabilia, such as archive of memorabilia, such as signed books, programs, and photos. The attention Escola has received in the last several months has made me nostalgic for a certain kind of queer theater, and diving into the archive can invigorate old passions. Additionally, for a new generation of academics, Busch's extensive record offers a window into several different moments of queer theater history. The well-rehearsed adage reminds us that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Looking over the archival elements of Busch's breakthrough Vampire Lesbians of Sodom and comparing them with the emerging Escola archive, we can see definite echoes. In both cases, the critics hailed the arrival of a queer auteur and noted the delirious effects their shows had on the audiences. Responses to the performances also link their success with their queer antecedents, and in Busch's case, his contemporary, Charles Ludlam. One of the notable features of tracing Bush's career through the archive is to notice how his public identity evolves from queer wunderkind to a shorthand for a camp comedy aesthetic. As a prolific playwright, drag performer, and nightclub entertainer, Bush has achieved legendary status in the last 40 years, and in nearly every single review, Escola's play and performance are compared with Bush's recognizable brand. It's exciting to think about Escola's own professional trajectory and how it might be imbricated in archives of performers they will inspire and have already inspired. Finally, examining Bush's archive through the lens of the O'Mary juggernaut, we're confronted with questions about how Bush's career might have been different if he shot to stardom in an era in which drag is a hot commodity and queer is more mainstream. RuPaul's Drag Race has produced bona fide celebrities with crossover appeal, a phenomenon unimaginable in the Reagan years when Vampires premiered. Some of the O'Mary reviews raise this point while considering the work of Ludlum and Bush. For instance, the subtitle for a review in the Wrap claims Cole Escola stands in triumph on the shoulders of two amazing trailblazers and argues Escola achieves what such cross-dressing trailblazers as Charles Ludlum and Charles Bush were never allowed to do. Bush's Red Scare on Sunset and The Divine Sister, as well as Ludlum's Irma Vep and Gallus, could have played Broadway with the respective creators on stage. All they lacked were producers willing to take the plunge. What a difference a few intrepid money people make. Revisiting Bush's work and celebrating his momentous achievement reminds me that the queer archive can illuminate the narrative of a scrappy fringe performer turned Hall of Fame inductee, but it also shines a light on the what might have beens. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. So next up we have Al Evangelista.
Thank you. I'm just gonna get my screen shared here and get it organized. Apologies, I am not in my usual setup, so this might take a quick second. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here with all of you. My name is Al Evangelista. I use he, shop pronouns, and I join you today via flight diversion in the land of the Karen-Kawas people. I'm usually in the land of the Eries people at Oberlin College, and this flight diversion is also sponsoring the technology, so please feel free to let me know if anything is hiccuping. A special thanks to Dr. Caitlin Kane and Dr. Aaron Stoneking for including part of these remarks in an upcoming edited volume of dramaturgy published by Routledge coming out in the fall, Performing Inheritive Archives. We face each other in a time of precariousness. Some might argue times are always precarious. Even so, the precocity I speak towards today acknowledges at best the purposeful ignorance of breaths and bodies, and at worst, actions on that ignorance. In performance, we are faced with breath and bodies that are on display for us to witness today, right now. Our digital faces, voices, and thoughts are brought together to queer archives and bring to light this precariousness. In this theater, audience members face one another. The stage separates viewers into two opposing groups. Audience members must make a choice about which side to sit on, placed between them in the center of the alleyway stage, almost as if forgotten, stands Balikbai on boxes with red bamboo mats on top. A dancer cautiously approaches a mat, brushes it smooth, lifts their hand and places their hand on the mat, softly at first, and then with the weight and lean of their chest. As they shift their weight onto the box, sound reverberates into the space. When the dancer's hand is removed and their body leans back, the audio abruptly stops with the sound of a record scratch. Sound and gesture are linked. With another weighted press, we hear a brief phrase, quote, "This exhibition is the first comprehensive display of the Filipinos," end quote. And then the announcement stops with another record scratch. movement in this performance activates archival sound, analysis, and descriptions of people from the Philippines on display at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. Some archives describe what happened at the 1904 World's Fair as a human zoo, others as human exhibits. What matters is that this exhibit was rooted in the racist practices of eugenics. In this theater, dancers, their bodies, and their weight bring these archives into performance. I'm offering today the artistic direction and dramaturgy for Somewhere Good, which intentionally activates archives relevant to anti-racism practices via queer choreography and technology. So Somewhere Good was an evening-length dance theater performance originally debuted at Oberlin College with a cast of undergraduates. Through queer choreography and technology, it activated these archives of anti-Asian rhetoric and violence at the 1904 World's Fair. There is also an augmented reality component, but I'm happy to chat about it during Q&A just because of time. So the performance used embodied research and digital contextualization to invite audiences to engage in these histories and narratives. And the production also utilizes movement technology and a focus on marginalized voices to offer a counter narrative to dominant archives. I'm going to end here for now. 3 minutes. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Al. So next up we have Kel, and Kel, I will time you and let you know.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Mine should stay, I think, within the time. So my presentation maybe takes our conversation further back to the kind of bare bones question of what does it mean to archive and how do archives operate, and then how do members of the public interact with archives. I work in a history museum, and one of the grounding principles of the work that we do at New York Historical Society is this idea that objects tell stories, that by encountering the actual authentic things of the past, we can actively engage with the realities that people lived in the past. And we try to activate the materials that we showcase in the museum, as well as through our curriculum guide materials, in ways that can amplify the voices that might otherwise be left out of the historical record. And this was work that really got started at New York Historical decades ago. There was a show called Slavery in New York. And to tell that story through primary source objects and documents was incredibly difficult because very few items had been specifically preserved from enslaved peoples here in New York. So the idea was that by using some of the same objects that might be on display in order to celebrate the lives of the important rich white people who lived in New York, we could actually amplify the voices of those who had been enslaved. It was all about trying to find how those objects could speak, but speak differently, right? So if we're thinking about for example, kitchen items, thinking about the ways in which, rather than thinking about who sat and dined at that table, thinking about who would have been the people who would have been preparing the food to exist on that table or serving from that particular table. So in my practice as someone who works in the museum setting, this is something that we think really actively about. How can we be engaging in an inquiry-based practice that allows our visitors, our students, our participants in programs to hear more than a singular interpretation of what they might encounter when they visit a museum? And this process to bring pedagogy into the conversation builds on a lot of threads of inquiry-based practice, where we engage folks in a pursuit of slow or close looking, where we really de-emphasize a pursuit of, oh, you must get the correct answer, and rather in its place, emphasize a practice of finding evidence, putting that evidence together, and allowing that evidence to guide the interpretation that someone might make about the historical material. And this can be a very empowering practice because it values the role of the visitor, the viewer, the student in the meaning-making process. And that's important because it allows them to bring their own perspectives, their own interests, their own biases, their own considerations into the way in which they might interpret the material, leaving open perhaps a greater aspect of possibility when it comes to what something might mean or how something can speak about the past. And in my work at New York Historical, we've done a lot of this for educators in terms of finding ways to recontextualize how and where we can reinsert women into the story that we tell of American history. So the main curriculum guide project that I work on is the Women in the American Story curriculum guide, which is a 10-unit history of the United States from 1492 to 2001 that covers all of the same major historical events and historical people and historical significant things, but does so in ways that center the experience, voices, and impacts on women. And when I came into this role, this raised an interesting question for me. And this is actually the idea that I interviewed for my job with, was how could we do this same project like WAMS, but do it from a queer perspective? What would it mean to queer the American story? What kind of historical archive would that create? And how would that then be valuable to us as researchers, as educators, as archivists, and the various roles that we have in the cultural field? And thinking through this work, I mentioned the word possibility earlier. This article by Margaret Middleton has been really central to my consideration as a museum education specialist of how we can ensure that those overlooked and obscured queer voices can still be present in our historical archives, even when they may not be explicitly identified within that queer archive, right? That we can infer somebody's queerness through the details that we do have about their lives. For example, they might have not have had access to some of the language that we have today, and we can use more appropriate pronouns, for example, to talk about someone from the past than they might have had access to in their own era. In a descriptive sense, thinking about the way in which we can move away from the sort of fear that people sometimes have in museum settings of getting the history wrong, misidentifying someone, and think more about, right, describing things as queer, thinking about queer as a lens, as an aesthetic marker, as something that can frame an understanding as opposed to simply as an identity. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, taking an imaginative approach, right? Drawing those non-linear parallels across and between eras and people and experiences that suggest if we claim something as queer now, we should then be empowered to claim it as queer in the past. And this then, right, idea of possibility for me always brings me back to this question of what would a queer history archive look like? What would that be? How would that operate? How would that function? And I always come back to this quotation from Robert Mills, which seems to really challenge what we know of how formal archives are made, where there's all this fully verifiable primary source documentation that constitutes a history archive. And Mills pushes us towards imagining another way of archiving that includes a lot of those things that are quite the opposite of that fully documentable, verifiable truth that I think could be really empowering and really provocative when we think about a concept of queer possibility. And to close out my thoughts today, at New York Historical, we are going to be in partnership hosting in our physical building, the American LGBTQ plus Museum in just about 2 short years at this point. So sort of raising the question for all of you about your thoughts on what are your dreams of what this could be, what this should be, what this can be, now that we are actually at a moment where there is going to be a major cultural institution taking up exactly the pursuit that we're talking about in this more theoretical context? And I'll hold it there.
Thank you very much, Kel. And as someone who has brought classes to the New York Historical Society, and Kel has led tours, I know some of others in the room have also done that. It's really excellent, the work that you're doing, Kel, and hopefully we can come back to talk more about that. So next up we have Sean.
Hey everyone, lovely to see all of you. Can you see this? Yeah? Okay, so as always seems to be the case, Kel and I are totally talking about a similar thing, which is our careers always do that, I think. You know, the first 10 years of my career was very much dedicated to thinking through the notion of queer legacy and looking at particularly at downtown queer performance and the legacy of Charles Ludlam and the Ridiculous Theater. And I worked in a lot of archives, did a lot of performance ethnography work. And I found the major challenge of that kind of work was so much contradiction in stories people were telling. And so I think that is one generative way to think about queer possibility. But the work that I'm doing now is much earlier. It's about first period America, and it's thinking through the notion of how do we think of a queer notion of performance when there is no archive, when it is only absence, when it is about the disembodied rather than the embodied. So I'm going to talk about this house, which is my house, actually, in Norwichtown, Connecticut. It was built in 1698. It is known because it was the house of a diarist named Sarah Knight, who's the first published Puritan woman in America. And also it played deeply into Benedict Arnold's childhood in Connecticut. But what I want to talk about, it's called Ancient Elm, the house, is this room, which is an attic bedroom. We decided, my husband and I, to turn it into an art gallery we call Gallery for Ghosts, with the premise that the people who would have slept in this room would have been enslaved. Connecticut slavery was not abolished till 1840, which is horrifying. The enslaved, the indentured, perhaps Irish maids in the 19th century. So our vision for this space, this room, basically was, let's create a gallery that is not ever open to the public. It is only there for the ghosts or the spectral people who inhabited this house. But as we did more research about the house, well, there are certainly records of sale. We know owners of the house for 326 years. There is no record of all of the people who would have traveled through this tavern. It was a tavern for about 200 years and slept in this particular room. So I'm going to go left of left field, basically, and go into a little bit of discursive theoretical work right now, and then I'll talk about specifically how this applies to Gallery for Ghosts and archiving. Through her querying of phenomenology, Sarah Ahmed examines what it means for bodies to be situated in space and time. Bodies take shape as they move through the world, directing themselves toward or away from objects and others. Being orientated means feeling at home, knowing where one stands, or having a potential archive of objects within reach. J. Rees Faust connects Ahmed's materiality of the object with Derrida's notion of hauntology. Haunting implies the staging of an event, or rather haunting understood as a performative embodiment that relies on an engagement with a material or temporal presence, i.e. people are haunted. Haunting is done to them. And this is the notion of sort of like haunting as an external force. This relates as well to Heather Love's queer concept of feeling backward into the past, where affect may be ignited by historical archives, even if esoteric or marginalized. As a contradistinction, I'm arguing for a queering of phenomenalism rather than phenomenology, wherein reality is grounded in a sense or sensing of the unrecorded or the unarchived past as spectral. Queer phenomenalism does not necessarily travel backward, as with Love's politics of loss, but rather spectrally traverses in myriad directions, channeled through an observer in the present. In other words, I suggest that the spectral does not haunt people as much as it travels through them. Unlike Derrida's hauntology, my queer phenomenalist approach imagines an objective materiality grounded in the spectra as sensual, creating performative work that is non-ontological and queerly disembodied in order to be re-embodied through a subjective engagement with its absence. I promise I'll apply this. It is neither dependent on live performance nor a live interaction with the human body. In contrast to Marvin Carlson's now ubiquitous haunted stage, which is indebted to the phenomenon of the déjà vu, I argue that the spectrality of queer phenomenalism is grounded in the jamais vu, the never seen, or the feeling that something is unreal or unusual, while at the same time knowing it is something you are very familiar with. So where I see this notion of queer phenomenalism taking place is this exhibit, which took place in Gallery for Ghosts this spring. And it was a performance where there was a series of tarot cards over a month, and every day tarot cards were laid out on this table in the room. Well, at the same time, the Gallery for Ghosts was virtually projected into a gallery in New York City, where there also was a table where tarot cards of the same deck were laid out every day. So even though we do not have an archive of the people in this room, and I don't necessarily believe in the kind of corroborated spectral voice of the tarot cards, what it does do is opens a channel, a disembodied channel between this space that can't be visited essentially, and hopefully allows people to kind of imaginatively think through the possibilities of the queer past. And this project in many ways was really inspired by the upcoming semi-quincentennial, which I'm sure Kel is working on a ton too. People are so obsessed with it. And when you look at the website, the official website, it's so much about, of course, post-1776, but it's this very kind of joyful, colorful celebration of corroborated evidence of America. And it seems to erase a lot of the violence and trauma of first period American colonialism. So that's it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Sean. Next up, we have Allison.
Hello, I'm just going to share my screen real quick. Okay. Can everybody see my screen? Yeah, great, thank you. Hi, I'm Allison. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a current MA student in Theater and Performance Studies at University of Colorado Boulder. And this is my first ever ATHE conference, so I'm really excited to be here. So this is about, also I apologize if any of the cars outside my house are really loud. So this project is based on a blog I started called From Woman's Eyes, which I started as a capstone project for the Applied Shakespeare Certificate program at CU Boulder. So this kind of ties into the question of what is the significance of creating a legacy through these narratives. When stories are not recorded and told, it can be easy to assume certain demographics did not exist in certain spaces. For example, when I studied theater in my undergraduate years, most of the playwrights given focus were white, presumed heterosexual men from before the 21st century. And the result of this was that I mistakenly believed that women were not really all that involved in theatrical spaces before the 18th century until I took a history of theater course my senior year, and my professor brought up Roswitha of Gandersheim, who was a first century female playwright. I thought that was amazing, and it made me wonder who else was not getting their due in the historical narrative. And as book bannings and other forms of censorship of queer voices have amped up in the past few years, I was inspired to archive the stories of my queer compatriots in Shakespearean theater so that our thoughts and work will not become another casualty of the Western tendency to only highlight the work of heterosexual men as groundbreaking, visionary, or thoughtful. So As part of From Women's Eyes, I do an interview series called Shakespeareans in Action. And through this interview series, I've interviewed contemporary Shakespeare practitioners who work as directors, actors, educators, scholars, all sorts of different disciplinary ways to be involved in Shakespeare. And through this, I got to thinking about what constitutes a queer archive and how it should be curated. I think this is an interesting question because queer identity is something to me that constantly changes and expands from generation to generation. Queer identity has in the last decade become a lot more visible in the US through legal proceedings like Obergefell versus Hodges. And according to the Pew Research Center, in 2022, about 5% of young adults in the United States identified as transgender and or non-binary, and the share of adults who knew someone who was transgender had increased from 42% in 2021 and 37% in 2017. With these demographic increases and the higher visibility of queer bodies in everyday life, I feel like gender expansionism will be a hot topic in the next frontier in queer history. Media such as Barbie has normalized queer bodies in blockbusters. Plays and musicals like A Strange Loop have challenged the white centrism of queer portrayals in theater. Therefore, I believe queer archives should be curated with two guidelines in mind: flexibility to accommodate new and evolving expressions of queerness, and acknowledgement of the myriad of co-identities that have contributed to and allied with queer movements. With From Women's Eyes, I aim to accomplish this by interviewing Shakespeare practitioners who identify as queer both either sexually, for example, lesbian or bisexual, gender-wise, for example, non-binary, transgender, genderqueer, or both. If a practitioner identifies as queer, they are queer. I also try to interview practitioners from different backgrounds, racially, ethnically, age-wise, and geographically, to get a fuller picture of how queer identity has been experienced in theater nationwide. What conversations are happening in, say, New York City theater are not necessarily the same conversations that are happening in the rest of the country. So I try when I interview people to not get the same demographic in a row. And these are on the screen some of the examples of the people that I've gotten to interview so far this series. I'm very lucky to have gotten a window into their artistic and scholastic worlds. So thank you so much. It's my contact information. Also, you could follow From Women's Eyes on Instagram. Okay.
Thank you so much, Allison, and we're so happy that you could be here at your first ATHE conference, and thank you so much for joining our session. We hope to see you at many more conferences in future. So next up we have Kristen.
Hello, everyone. So nice to see everybody. So my name is Kristen Wright. I'm an assistant professor of drama at NYU Tisch. And I'm talking about the Black queer 19th century and how it's reflected in contemporary plays specifically. So I was interested in 4 of the questions that were posed. Oh, also she, her pronouns too. So particularly, how do we effectively tell the stories of the queer past? And so again, I'm writing about contemporary Black queer playwrights engaging the 19th century. And so I think that it's important to effectively tell this because I think there's still this idea that queerness, especially when you hear these conversations about like trans identity, is something contemporary. It's something like post-Stonewall. And so I think by engaging the queer past, by engaging the 19th century, you know, we show that that is not in fact true. Also to the significance of creating a legacy through these narratives. I think the interesting thing about all of these Black queer playwrights that I'm engaging is that they're not a monolith. They have very different approaches to engaging the 19th century archive. And so particularly, you know, writing these figures into the historical moment, I'm thinking of Danye Love, who wrote Sugar in Our Wounds, which is about this sort of queer love between these two men, James and Henry, on a plantation. And so this is part of a bigger project that Love is engaged in, where he is writing about Black love at sort of these different historical moments. But I think what's interesting too is that there's this character, Aunt Mama, who's like a sort of a maternal, like elder Black woman in this show, but she's also a lesbian. And so like there is like a queer identity. It's not just about these men and not just about sort of marginalizing her too. And it's, you know, it's very sentimental. So I teach it in my my melodrama, my honors seminar. And I think that it got mixed reviews. And I think that was because of it's sort of the critics' unwillingness to kind of engage with sentiment as a radical tool, as a tool that can mobilize an important emotional response and change through sentiment as well. And so I also want to talk about Jeremy O. Harris and Brandon Jacobs Jenkins, of course, obviously very deeply entrenched in the 19th century, particularly Jeremy O. Harris's infamous slave play. So again, you know, slave play is about contemporary people, but they're engaging with this sort of 19th century iconography. Harris describes it as a comedy of sorts, deeply and broadly use of Southern accents. It's very ironic and provocative, very controversial for its depictions of rape and sexual violence, particularly a final scene where Jim, who is a white British man, rapes his partner, Kenesha, who's a Black woman. And also there was a lot of criticism for kind of thinking of slavery as this thing that can be therapeutic. So there's and it was even protested as well. It was originally at New York Theater Workshop, and there were literally people picketing outside too. So it was very controversial. And then I want to talk about Brandon Jacobs Jenkins too. So the 19th century is all over Brandon Jacobs Jenkins' work, particularly in Octoroon, which is his adaptation of the 1859 Dion Boucicault play about, you know, a sort of mixed race woman. It's a melodrama about her tragic death. And Brandon Jacobs Jenkins basically treats it as a joke, you know. So, you know, one of the final scenes of the play is these sort of enslaved Black women mocking her death. And so, like, it's, you know, very ironic. I'm thinking of his Appropriate as well, which was sort of recently on Broadway with Sarah Paulson, and how this is a kind of a family play, but also about how the family play sort of smashes into this legacy of racial violence. So it's about this white family who finds these images of lynched Black people. And there's a really particularly disturbing moment where I think Jacobs Jenkins is offering us a commentary on the predatory nature of white queers in particular, where Reese, who's the teenage son, is sort of masturbating to gay porn, and then and at his feet you see these images of these lynched Black men. So, you know, very kind of like a disturbing tension there too. And then this sort of how can we make sure that many voices are heard through the retelling of history or teaching of history. I think producing these plays by Black queer playwrights that engage with the 19th century, writing about it, discussing it, what we're doing in this space today is really important. And then finally, how do artists also engage as teachers of their own archives? And so I think, again, we have these artists who are choosing what aspects of the archive to highlight. So we have Danye Love, who again is operating in this very kind of sentimental mode, which is like very 19th century in itself. You know, he wanted queer people to see themselves in history. And then you have like the very irony-pilled Jeremy O'Harris and Jacob Jenkins, who are kind of really using humor to sort of illustrate this enduring nature of anti-Blackness and how it bleeds into this contemporary moment. And, you know, even as they have been accused of participating in anti-Blackness themselves, particularly Harris. Um, so I'm really thinking too, just to wrap it all up, of sort of, you know, Saidiya Hartman and sort of engaging the afterlife of slavery and how it is constantly appearing in these contemporary Black playwrights who are engaging the 19th century. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kristen. There's so much in all these presentations. It's hard just to like move on to the next one, but I am taking lots of notes, and I hope everyone else is also taking notes, and we can come back to these things. But thank you, everyone, so far. And next up, we have Bess.
Hey, everyone. Yes, I also want to respond to everything I've just been listening to, but instead, I am going to share this this thing that is very much in media res. So please bear with me. There are a lot of thoughts and not a lot of answers so far. And it will not let me share. Oh, yes, it will. Okay, here we go. All right. So this is a presentation that I'm now calling Winterbound, Chilly Lesbians, Proto-Trans Representation, and the Elusive Thomas Dickinson. So I was doing research on a new book that I have that is in process right now. And I stumbled across this really interesting article actually about the Children's Hour. And it had a fascinating single sentence in it that made me stop and think for a second. So I wanted to share that sentence with you so that you can see what I'm talking about. So Mary Titus in her 1991 Murdering the Lesbian, Lillian Hellman's The Children's Hour, begins her article by saying American theaters in the late 1920s and early 1930s presented several more or less controversial plays exploring the dangerous attraction of lesbianism, particularly to young women in all-female environments. Between 1926 and 1933, for example, New York saw productions of The Captive, 1926, Winterbound, 1928, and Girls in Uniform, 1933. So funnily enough, I had heard of two of the three of those plays, and I was shocked that there might be a lesbian play I didn't know about, since that seemed absurd to me at the time. But sure enough, there was this play Winterbound that I didn't know anything about. So I went to We Can Always Call Them Bulgarians by Kerr Curtin, which is one of my very happy sort of Bibles of queer theater from the early 20th century, and found that he had a single short chapter on this play that basically dismissed it entirely, saying that the only important thing about it was that Tony, the main character, is the first example of, his words, a bull dyke on stage, but that in every other way, it was just completely derivative of The Captive and really wasn't worth kind of the paper it was printed on. But then I also realized that it wasn't printed on any paper. It was never published. So I went down this rabbit hole that you will follow me on now, where I went to the New York Public Library to see the single copy of this play that still exists, which is the author Thomas H. Dickinson's own copy of it. And I read this play thinking, okay, this is going to be a stupid play, but at least I will have read it and I will understand the critiques. I'll understand how it fits into things. And then I found out that it really actually isn't a terrible play at all. And the character that they keep calling a bull dyke is in fact what I think is proto-trans representation. So the lead character in this play is described as a tomboy, but also is referred to by male gender pronouns for much of the play, ostensibly, according to the stage directions, as a joke, but never actually as a joke, and a joke when nobody else is in the room to make a joke too. So I started kind of wondering what this is and what this play is doing and why we haven't considered it more seriously over time. The first reason, obviously, is that it's not quite in the archive. It is very limited in terms of access. Most people are simply talking about it. But my first order of business was to go try to learn some more about the author himself. And that is what I started to find this interesting thing, which is that you cannot find out much about this author. His name is Thomas Dickinson. He doesn't have a birth certificate. All I found out at first, all that's mentioned in the book, is that he ended his life as a farmer in Connecticut, which is where the play Winterbound is set, around a farmer in Connecticut, in Fairfield, Connecticut. So the more I looked into this fella, I found some pictures of him, which I will show you now. This is our fella here. This one on the left is apparently a graduation photo of him from college. And the one on the right is a passport photo from the 1930s or 40s. I have zoomed in and cannot quite tell if this is a mustache or just a shadow, hard to tell. But if you're getting an Alfred Nobbs vibe, I did too. I cannot prove that this person was born a man, that he was assigned male at birth. I also can't prove that he wasn't. But either way, I've been kind of going down this rabbit hole of thinking about what it means to pull someone out of the queer archive who is sort of an ambiguous figure, and I can't quite say one way or the other who this person is. But also, because they're on this call, this session, I want to shout out Janet Werther for talking me through this and also helping me kind of say out loud, I think this person might be trans, but I can't prove it. So that's kind of where I am in the middle of things. I will end it there, but I have a lot of questions. I have very few answers, but I'm chasing this guy down the rabbit hole. Thanks all.
Thank you, Bess. So next up we have Stefano.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stefano Boselli, pronouns he, him. I'm assistant professor of theater history at UNLV, University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And I'm trying to share, it's a short PowerPoint. It's visible, okay. I've called this Poking the Archives, Post-Human Goals and Unexpected Queer Findings in Alfredo Arias's Commedia Repostera. And so this is part of, let me see if I can find something. Okay. Okay. I'm sorry. That's not what I want to find. Let's see. Okay. I don't know if this is still visible, but I'm going to read. During the summer of 2017, I embarked on a transatlantic research expedition in France and Argentina, seeking information from both physical and living archives on the performance work of a group of Argentina exiles who achieved success in Paris, but also returned to Buenos Aires after 1983 with the military dictatorships end. And although my focus was on post-human assemblages in theater making, and definitely not queer studies at the beginning, several artists I was tracking identified as gay and queer. So because of the prominence of non-human actors, a production in particular by Alfredo Arias, that I'm gonna, okay, so this Commedia Repostera was interesting because it talked about cakes and how this Doña Gandulfo and her TV shows, cooking shows, basically tied in with the let's say post Peronism and the political situation in Argentina. Doña Petrona de Gandulfo. And she charmed her audiences with creative instructions for surrealist cakes, some of them touching on nationalist themes during this Peron's populist presidency. Not finding any recordings in Paris with Arias himself, I reached out to both the filmmaker who had captured the production and later met in person with the director. However, I was not granted permission to even watch the show, leaving me with a lingering sense that I should explore more. Luckily, a physical archive provided what the living ones were reluctant to, since a recording of an earlier stage reading in Spanish, Commedia Recostera, was available at the Centro Cultural San Martín in Buenos Aires. At the core of the show lay Arias's personal story. Seeing him avidly watch Doña Petrona's cooking shows, his mother had feared that he would, quote, become effeminate, end quote, and enrolled him in a military high school, which paradoxically meant for Arias more immediate discovery of queer desire. Although the information was not new to me after reading Arias's autobiography, the author's highly emotional way of sharing his experience here provided me for the first time with a fuller understanding of his presence. And in this situation that I found myself, this is the book that I wrote on the Argentines of Paris, I was able to look at this reading, and the fact is, I found myself with an artist who was trying to not help me do the research work, but kind of hindered me. So let's say that with aging, and that was one of the questions that we were trying to respond to. With aging comes the desire to kind of make sure that the archive yields only the things that were beautiful. So, for example, he was interested in a book on his group that was all images, but no words. And I was interested in the words. He was interested in the now of being an artist. And he said, I'm also a creator, but he wasn't interested in the past. And so, in a way, I was forced to go around the artist in this case. So many of you have worked on artists who are happy to be researched and studied. In this case, this is a kind of different situation. Okay. And so this is an image from that reading, which was imperfect, but at the same time was very emotional, and really we found demonstrated his involvement in the story, and in its imperfection, in its pitches. That's pretty much it. Sorry for the complication with the technology.
No worries, Stefano. Thank you. So just a quick note that because we're a little bit over time in general, we might just reorganize things after we get through the rest of the presentations to have a general discussion with everyone rather than try to integrate the breakout rooms as well. So as you all know, this is how it goes, but we're just really happy to hear all of your work and research. And so next we're going to move on to Annie.
Hi, all. I'm so happy to be here. I'm trying to share my screen. Yes. Can you see this image? Yes. Okay, cool. So I'm Annie. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Performance Studies at NYU Tisch. And I'm so excited to be here today. Thanks to Cal and Ben and Bess for convening this session. All right. So in 1998, Mohawk theater and performance artist and self-proclaimed transformed woman who loves women, Ayanna Miracle, pitched an idea for a children's opera to a principal of an elementary school in North Vancouver. The opera was Miracle's contribution to the school's drama ed curriculum and would take place over a school year. Unfortunately, Miracle's production was never staged before her death due to a lack of institutional funding and support. Yet her research into the children's opera, correspondence with educational officials, and the opera's libretto exemplify a commitment to the decolonization of settler children's relationship to each other, their bodies, animals, and the land through Indigenous worldviews in a post-colonial context, with opera, a European genre. Drawing on my research in Miracle's papers at the University of Victoria's Transgender Archives, this session has prompted the following questions. What is the significance of extending the legacy of an artist and educator like Miracle through unfinished and unrealized projects and archival fragments? What role might the archive play in introducing Miracle as an Indigenous, queer, and trans elder to children, a new generation? How can we ensure that Indigenous trans women's voices like Miracle's are heard through the retelling or teaching of anti-decolonial history among children and youth when they are so often denied or erased in elementary curriculum throughout North America? And finally, how did Miracle act as a teacher or a director in the compilation and preservation of her own archival collection? Miracle left drama educators the rich legacy, the dream, as she called it, of a children's opera that invites settler children to unlearn colonial mastery over Indigenous land and life and rehearse a shared, unowned earth. With Miracle as my teacher and her dream of directing a children's opera at elementary school laid out in a thin baby blue folder as my guide, my contribution to this session introduces an archival and transfeminist how-to. How to make a beloved trans teacher and elder's dream come true. And the answer for me as a queer and trans settler scholar and educator working in the field of theater and performance studies and who lives and teaches in Miracle's wake is, I think, quite simple. I stage it. I recover its repertoire in the tradition of applied theater and drama education. I proliferate her dream with as many drama educators who, like myself, work with children and young people, so as to make Miracle's dream of an anti-decolonial children's opera come true. How grand. I honor Miracle's ongoing and unfinished legacy in the realization of her dreams, and I do this as I bear the burden of the labor, and she is at rest. In Miracle's archive, I was a student being schooled in the anti-decolonial drama education I could have had and should have had as a settler child who grew up not in Vancouver, but in Toronto. Drawing on my time as a visiting researcher at University of Victoria, I was so taken with the idea of drama education for settler children, imbued with Miracle's anti and decolonial wisdom and experience as a queer and trans elder, artist, and educator, right? This was a drama teacher I wish I had as a kid. Miracle believed that settler children could change, that they might relinquish colonial mastery of Indigenous land and life and be and become different through a children's drama sung. Miracle's archive is a repository for her dreams. Anti-decolonial dreams constitute and enliven Miracle's archive. They exist in yet unrealized projects and ambitions for children. What could have been possible for that group of children in North Vancouver in 1998? I mourn how much they could have learned from Miracle. And so in Miracle's papers, we find archival evidence of a life-changing project for young lives that never happened, but should have happened and can still happen. Tucked away in a notebook in Miracle's papers is a sketch of a smiling child, not drawn by Miracle, with the phrase, "Oh, you smile now," written in an unfamiliar handwriting in the bottom right-hand corner. The drawing only features the bottom half of the child's face, as if they are smiling mindlessly at the world or stuck in a daydream. On the back of the sketch, written in Miracle's familiar, pointed, and steady script, is the following word: awaken. Miracle dreams so that children will awaken. Opera, in its Latin etymology, means work, and Ayana means eternally blooming, constantly transforming, as Miracle writes of her name in a notebook. She affirms herself in the same sentence, and she will, I respond from the McPherson's Library reading room at the University of Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annie. That's sounds like an incredible archive that I didn't know about in Victoria. So thank you so much for sharing that. Next up, we have Tanya.
Hi, how are you? Hi, I'm just going to share this while can you see that on my screen?
Yep.
Okay, all right. I'm going to take a little different approach because I'm talking literally about one person's archive. My name is Tanya Elder, and I'm the project archivist for the Michael Feingold papers. And my pronouns are she, hers, hers, yeah. So Michael Feingold was a theater critic of the radical newspaper, The Village Voice, from 1971 to 2013. And he was known for his fiery critiques, particularly of shows that angered him, such as Miss Saigon for its misappropriation of Vietnamese as depicted during the Vietnam War, or Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical Cats with its misappropriation, I would say, of cats. That's just a joke. But Michael was also a poet, author, playwright, translator, adapter, lyricist, dramaturg, editor, mentor, and literary manager. He was a singular voice of American and European theater for American audiences, ranging from experimental theater to Broadway to opera. He was also a cultural critic of America and a prominent voice in the gay rights movement. Feingold was born in Chicago in 1945 and grew up in a conservative Jewish household. He began his career in 1962 as a Columbia University undergraduate and then graduate student at Yale. At Yale, he was the managing editor of a new journal called Yale Theater at the height of the Vietnam War, which coincided with the publication of this volume, Crisis 1968, Crisis and Imagination. And it also features a political cartoon, a cartoon based on Method Man, which is a cartoon featuring a superhero actor meant to poke fun at method acting. He was also the first literary director of the Yale Repertory Theater, where he worked with fellow Yale students Meryl Streep, Christopher Durang, Henry Winkler, and Sigourney Weaver. At Yale, he adapted Brecht and Weill's Happy End, which moved to Broadway with Streep and Christopher Lloyd. And he moved back to New York in 1971, where he worked at the Winter House Publishing House, editing a series of groundbreaking books of plays, including Sam Shepard's Mad Dog Blues and other plays, Robert Patrick's Cheap Theatrics, Promenade and other plays by Maria Irene Fornés, works by Rochelle Owens, Adrian Kennedy, Amiri Baraka, and somewhat surprisingly, Le Script Greece. Beginning from Michael's time at Columbia in 1962, Michael's papers, which actually surround me here in this office, offer and serve as a historical bridge spanning the end of a turbulent 20th century to the start of a turbulent but different 21st century. Its documentation includes very out there theater as well as mainstream Broadway, and it presents a queer man in many senses of the word who had something to say about everything. In 1965, a friend wrote to Michael, "I resist the opportunity to quote from a letter you sent me last summer, where you said, 'Don't show this letter to anybody. Enough people think I'm queer as it is.' I hope," his friend continued, "the quote is exact since the letter has long been destroyed." Now, we don't have that letter that Michael wrote to his friend, nor can we know exactly what his friend meant, but the word queer means strange or odd, but whether the word means strange or odd, Michael, for those who knew him, would probably admit that he was both. Queer as an out gay man, especially after 1970, or even queer in its original meaning, to spoil or ruin. Michael did, in a way, spoil or ruin other people's work in his reviews or when he turned his gaze toward politics and culture, especially if he didn't like something. However, there were several instances in which Michael spoiled or ruined his own work by biting off more than he could chew due to multiple commitments. Sadly, this caused him to miss out on some major productions, particularly a Spanish to English translator of Manuel Puig's Broadway stage production of Kiss of the Spider Woman. When Michael died, he left a large 2-bedroom apartment and 3 storage units of material, including his personal papers, theatrical related books, historical theater collection, records, DVDs, and artwork. To give you some idea of what constitutes a queer archive, let me give you this anecdote. When the estate contacted a record buyer regarding the album collection, the buyer said another prominent gay man in the theater had recently passed away with a similar type of collection. Therefore, they were not interested in the albums, as they were mostly duplicative material that was already difficult to sell. But quickly, back to Michael's vast collection of personal archival materials. He left original and translated scripts from other playwrights, press packets, posters from Columbia and Yale productions, and every playbill or flyer of a show he saw in his lifetime, from the 1950s until the year he died in 2022. Most impressive in the collection is the correspondence, ranging from letters with his family, who were frequent Chicago theater goers, correspondence from young playwrights and directors, including Robert Patrick, Christopher Durang, Jim Nicola, other icons of the experimental theater like John-Claude Van Italy, Joe Chaikin, Charles Busch, and Eric Bentley. And the collection also includes controversial playwrights such as David Mamet, Sam Shepard, and Kenneth Bernard. The collection contains Michael's own work and exploration into gay theater, as evidenced in 1981 at the Gay American Art Second Annual Festival, where he directed Jeremiah Sullivan in a night of poetry readings called Fellow Feelings, with poems based on gay themes. And you can see the list of poems that they did that night. He also taught dramaturgy at NYU, mentored and nurtured playwrights such as David Greenspan and August Wilson. And while he could be gruff and dismissive, his primary love was the theater and how it could nurture and teach. So when you ask the question, how do you see queer time and queer failure playing to the construction of a queer archive? Part of my answer would be a collection that documents change or advocacy and or highlights their career and life and their journey from possible shame of being queer to self-acceptance and being out, from enough people think I'm queer to I am queer. Did that person or organization have deep connections to other artists or organizations that could shed light on a movement or a topic or a time? Lastly, Michael adapted Heinrich Ibsen's poems and works, including Ibsen's last play, When We Dead Awaken, primarily about an aging artist who loses and finds and then runs away with his muse as his happily freed wife, who has herself run off with a hunter who promises to show her the world from a mountaintop, says, I am free, I am free, I am free. Life's no longer a prison for me. I am free as a bird, I am free. Michael Feingold's papers document a man who demanded that we all be free by using the powerful voice of our theater to free ourselves from our own self-imposed prisons. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tanya. That was excellent. I also love that you are coming to us from the archive of Michael Feingold and that we can see the materials in the background. Also, I'm going to shamelessly promote JADT, which just published an interview with Jim, Nicola, and Tanya and others in the most recent issue that we published online. So you can check out more about that there. And Tanya, can you just stop sharing screen? Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm going to go super fast to speak about my project because I'd rather have more of a conversation with everyone. As many people already know in the room, I'm working on a book project that I'm publishing with University of Michigan, which is a collection of Split Britches works from the last 20 years. The title of the book is Split Britches 50 Years On. And it's been a project that I've been working on for a lot of years. Was the subject of my dissertation, and I went into the archives that Peggy Shaw and Lois Weaver had, both their physical archives, but also their incredible digital archive on their website, which includes just so many materials and continues to expand. But I wanted to just briefly talk about one piece that I worked on with them in 2014 at La Mama. A show called Desperate Archives, in which they took their entire, set of archival materials and staged it within a gallery space. So I'm just going to play a video in the background while I just speak very briefly about this. There's no sound. It's just a video, and I'm hoping that it shows up. Hold on. Is that showing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. It's just going to sort of play in the background. So in 2014, the Desperate Archives exhibition featured a repurposing of Split Britches archival materials from the then last 40 years of their work in order to explore and expose the issues of having, holding, and letting go of objects, ephemera, of feelings, and of the past. These interactive installations playfully critiqued the archival frenzy that was occurring at the time when there was also a craze to purge, declutter and tidy, a la Maria Kondo, whose book was published that same year in 2014. Audiences encountered piles of Split Britches archival materials in the exhibit and were invited to purchase souvenirs to add to their own archive. As co-collaborators, audience members were also invited to leave a contribution to the archive in the form of notes for the future. Desperate Archives revealed the infrastructure of Split Britches' creative process by highlighting the individual contributions made by collaborators such as Vivian Stoll, Stormy Brandenburger, Susan Young, Lori Eastside, Matt Delbridge, Eva Weiss, Saskia Schaefer, Joe Palmer, and others, including the audience. As collaborators on their intergenerational future, the Man Meet Collective populated the gallery with occasional live interventions as well. And Split Britches also hosted tours of these materials, recorded videos, and arranged them precariously throughout the gallery, which sadly no longer exists because La Mama Galleria closed in recent years. As I prepare to include this performance documentation in my forthcoming book, I'm also asking questions about our desperation to hold on to performance and queer performance as a medium that resists retention and prefers release. And let me just pause this and stop sharing my screen. One of the things that Peggy and Lois have been doing over the past year or so has actually been going through their own archives and getting rid of objects, getting rid of things because of the cost of storing their own archives and paying to keep their own archives. So any kind of duplicate materials and things they've been offloading. And so it's been a process and a conversation. And in a forthcoming interview in a special issue of Theater History Studies, is that the right name of the journal, Bess? Theater History Studies. I have an interview with Peggy and Lois about that process of going through their archives at this stage in their career. So it's definitely, all of the things that you've been talking about absence and presence, and it's very much resonating with my own projects. All right, so that's all I wanted to say. And oh, Tanya, you were there at the exhibition, wonderful. So as we mentioned before, thank you, we're gonna skip the breakout session rooms and just have everyone kind of be in conversation with one another. There was a lot of, crossovers and connections between these presentations. We have technically 10 minutes left, but also we've been told that the session after this, is not happening. And so we do have a few minutes extra. We don't have to eradicate the room immediately at 12:30, although some of you may have to. We recognize that and respect your time. So I'm just letting you know that. We'll just open up the conversation, first of all, to say, does anyone want to directly respond to another person's presentation or archive specifically? Or have any connections that you wanted to draw between your own archival work? Yes, feel free to raise your hand or just unmute. Jim, go ahead.
Actually, this question is for Bess. Bess, I don't know if you're familiar with Benji Cahan's Minor Perverts, I think is the title of the book.
Yes, that's the only other place this is discussed.
Yeah, and I was also wondering, because I know that play was close to The Well of Loneliness. Do you think there are any connections between the Butch character in Well of Loneliness, Stephen Gordon, and Tony in Winterbound?
That's the other thing that Keir Curtin talks about. It basically, again, at the time, a lot of people were saying, oh, this is just like Well of Loneliness. As someone who's encountered both of those works, no, I'm really confused at the way that people were willing to write this off. First of all, our Butch character here, Tony, and that's spelled Tony, by the way. Tony is like very stable in a lot of ways. It's Tony's house. And even though the play doesn't end great for her, and despite the fact that the other characters call Tony he, the stage directions refer to Tony as her. So that's what I'm using pronoun wise. But at the end of the play, Tony literally says, no matter what happens here, I'm going to be fine, because if I decide to leave this Connecticut farmhouse, I'm just going to get picked up back home and go back along with my existence, because I'm wealthy and everything is going to be fine, which is a very interesting kind of final moment to have there. But yeah, I mean, the play basically is based around a love triangle of sorts. And the language around that is really, really interesting. Tony's kind of girlfriend leaves Tony, not because she's in love with the one male character in this play that we really spend time with, but because she just decides it's more practical, basically, which again, so the way that the the way that the queerness is weighted in this play feels really different, which again immediately was a red flag for me, because I was like, this doesn't feel like it was written by a straight man. Like, no offense, but this feels different somehow. So that's why I've been kind of trying to find out more. But yeah, I have not yet read the Book of Minor Perverts, but I have it, and I've looked at some of what's in there. But it's interestingly not a theater text, so it's not a theater book like from the theater discipline. It's from a different like a sociological perspective. So I'm curious, but yeah, even that is a few years old now. So I'm interested to bring it back into the theater context in a particular way. But it was never copywritten, so now I have to wait until 2031 to do anything about it, because he died in 1961, this guy. So that's my other archival problem, copyright.
Janet, you have a question?
Well, I want to say thank you to everyone for your really interesting and provocative work. Bess, obviously we can talk about this more, but there has been a lot of interesting scholarship that takes up Stephen Gordon as both proto-trans and butch that might be interesting for your analysis. And I think that your point about the theater of it all remains really salient, because how would we stage this? What kind of person would we cast in this character is a relevant question that's not relevant to a novel like The Well of Loneliness. Ben, this is a very specific question, but have Lois and Peggy tried to have anyone acquire their archives? Has there been interest in their archives? I'm sort of shocked that since their digital archives are housed through NYU, that the downtown collection wouldn't take on their archives. And maybe this is, again, a conversation for outside this, but I think in terms of the broader questions of like what is or isn't available archivally, I'm really fascinated that they haven't been scooped up.
Yeah, just very briefly, and we can chat more about this, Janet, but the Fales archive does have some of their work, and the issue is that some of the things they don't necessarily want in the archive yet, which is also a question. As living artists, like they don't necessarily want all of their sort of like personal journals and work like entirely available. And also there's just like a lot of extra material that they're not sure what to do with and how to organize it. And so I think this probably also relates to, Tanya's work with the Feingold archive and other archives that we're talking about. And like, what do we keep? What about the issue of space? It costs money to host these archives within institutional spaces and acquire them. One other thing I'll say is that artists have very different feelings about archives. Like Peggy would just throw everything out if it was her way. She doesn't want any of it kept, whereas Lois is like, okay, we need to document these things because people might actually be interested in like knowing the process of this work later. Not in like an egotistical way, but just like being more sort of like knowledgeable about the interest in this work potentially and their legacy within the WOW, theater and other, queer, lesbian theaters and feminist theaters in the past. Sorry for that more long-winded answer than I planned. Tanya.
I just want to reiterate what Ben was saying. Sometimes it's really, I'm an archivist. I work at the American Jewish Historical Society for the most of the time. But what happens is that collections require money. Collections require an archivist, supplies, storage, description, and then dissemination for researchers. So sometimes it's very difficult, particularly in an archive like Michael's that has some issues with financial things, where people haven't really pounced on this collection to get it into their archive. Right now we have no home for it. It's just sitting here, and we have no idea where it's going to go right now. So there's a lot of issues when it comes to just putting archives into an archive. It's a much harder process than people actually think.
I mean, that's really interesting too. I think like there's a question about the ethics of the archive, right? And archiving, and like, you think about Jack Smith, who said, I want everything burned. Thank God it didn't happen because it's very useful. But at the same time, it is interesting when you think about the kind of the narrative of what the archive means to the creator versus the way that we're using it historiographically.
Right. And I think also, so Michael had no restrictions on his collection. He wanted it all out there except for a few pieces from the 1960s. But the thing is that there's a lot of correspondence from other people in his collection. So you also have to deal with their ideas, like you're saying, of whether they want to have these intimate things exposed, brought out, whatever. Because that's also an issue. Michael's like, hey, yeah, just everybody. And other people could be, well, maybe not. So there is the issue of privacy, because there's a lot of things in his collection that are a little, it's the 1960s, a lot of his stuff, and they're back and forth. And he's like, I don't know what I am, who I am. I hate this theater. I love this theater. I love you. I hate you. There's a lot of tea spilled in this collection. I just want to let you know. So there you go.
Well, if I could maybe take that opportunity then to throw that question to both Al and Kristen, right? Because what you're dealing with is contemporary artists taking up difficult archives and archives of racial oppression and using them to reintroduce those experiences and have us think critically about those experiences as audiences today. And I'm wondering what, who gets to have agency or desires or sort of subjectivity in telling those stories, and what are your thoughts on that from the work that you do?
Al, would you like to start?
No, please go for it, Kristen.
Okay. I mean, I think in terms of stories about kind of like the Black queer 19th century, I mean, I think that I feel like for me it's less about like who gets to tell them or who was allowed to tell them, and more about this sort of urgency to disclose. So you clearly see, like, especially with like Jeremy O. Harris, like, he's like really, I think he's really haunted, by the specter of the 19th century. And I was also thinking too about another kind of Hartman quote about this idea of critical fabulation. So like, as I was like listening to other people, I saw like the documents and the receipts and like all of this. Whereas, if you think about Harris or Brandon Jacobs Jenkins is like, well, I don't know what a slave sounds like, which is like not quite true, because it's like Zora Neale Hurston did interview like enslaved people. So I mean, there are like records like in that sense, but I do think that like these Black playwrights is less about who can tell this, and like more about who feels compelled to tell this, who feels compelled to disclose and reveal and grapple with the archive in this way too, who feels compelled to make these critical fabulations.
Hi, everyone. Just Al, before you respond, I'm going to say we're past time, but if it's okay with everyone, we'll like go to 1:40, just because these conversations are really provocative and we want to hear from everyone. But if you need to go, obviously we completely understand. And I just want to thank you all for being here. There's so many threads. I hope we continue to discuss them if you have to go, but please stay till 1:40 before we, then we'll close the room then. Sorry, Al, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No worries. No, thank you. Jana, thank you for the question. And similar to Kristen, and then also the way that Sean was talking about this embodied archive, this notion of agency came up a lot while choreographing, to think about the audience agency, like imposing some sort of historical eye or narrative or lens. And so what I wanted to do was play with an archive literally on stage, and then let the audience decide when they wanted to interact with that archive. So like the first act, there was what you would usually think is a dance theater performance. And then in the second act, it's the same exact choreography, but they watched it through their phone, through a QR code. And it showed the history, the text, or some of the images from the World's Fair. And they could bring it up and put it down as they wanted to, but I was thinking of agency in this way, and is a hard thing to get audience members to actually take out their phone during a performance and feel comfortable like moving it around. So it's an interesting question to think about what story and whose stories.
Jim, I had a question for you in terms of the relationship of legacies, because you talked about, and this relates to some of the other presentations as well, but just, you know, how Charles Busch receives sort of being in this legacy of the work of Cole and Ludlum, et cetera, because, you know, those kinds of questions of legacy are, you know, sometimes can be controversial. Like one time as just one example, one time I suggested, you know, to Peggy and Lois that they were in the legacy of Ludlum. And that was kind of, you know, offensive to them because they were like, well, actually we had our own legacy. I wasn't saying that's what they were, but I was asking if they felt in that legacy. And so I just want to know about the sort of controversy of legacy and being tied to specific artists or people over time, if you thought about
Sure. Well, as you know, we had a conversation with Charles, and he addressed that directly. One of the questions I had for him was, what was it like to be mentioned in all of these reviews? And he had a rather interesting response. It drew him back to his own experiences when he was coming up, continually being connected with the other Charleses, specifically Charles Ludlum and Charles Pierce. And he had said that Ludlum in particular was seemed rather resentful of this young upstart Charles Busch, who also shared his name. And Charles said that he has a similar feeling in a strange way of Cole Escola, that there was a kind of what he admitted to as like a professional jealousy or a professional resentment that here Cole Escola was getting the kind of acclaim that Charles Busch never did. So it's, I think it goes to this question of what happens when you become such a person with such a long career, that there does have that sense of protectiveness over one's career as well.
Do others have specific questions for other panelists, or I mean, more broadly, how do we think that there could be, if not, then more broadly, how do we think we could create some, I don't know, kind of cross connections of how we're dealing with the archive or the problems that we're facing in the archive? Because I heard a lot of echoes listening to everyone as you're trying to write about these archives or write about the artists working in archives or staging these archives or finding a home for these archives. So what connections did you see across the different presentations or even in your subgroups conversations?
I mean, it seems like one of the most basic things is, how do we tell these stories, right? What does queer historiography look like? Is it monolithic? I don't think it is, right? But that seems to be the kind of like core to everything that we're doing is how do we relate this in a lasting, important way?
I was thinking,
sorry.
I mean, I was thinking about, you know, the death of the author, right, at some point, and the author not being so involved in the interpretation of their work. And in this case, the archive, I mean, how do we grapple with the fact that certain artists want to curate their own archive, and but we want to discover other things, right? So do we listen to the artists, or do we just go our own way? And what do we do with that?
And I was just going to, similarly to Maya's presentation, Sean's, and other presentations as well, what do we do with figures who really want that sense of absence, want to hide within the archive and don't want to be revealed? And I think to Sean's point earlier about the ethics of the archive, well, then what business is it of ours of bringing them out of it?
I just like to say, in terms of Michael's archive, we're not even worried right now about interpretation or what's in it, really. All we're worried about right now is finding a home for him a wonderful collection that we cannot find a home for. This collection has major research in it from the 60s up until 2022, with artists, with his reviews. His reviews are even like, not even like most of the collection, just putting that all aside. But his work as a mentor, as a writer, an author, a director, that is the stuff that's really rich in this collection, and that right now has no home. And somebody please bring us home. Please bring Michael home. That's all I want.
I'm curious. I'm reading the chat as well too, and I wondered if Janet is interested. I was wondering if they wanted to expand on this engagement with Cole Escola and sort of non-binary gender, and just putting that out there. So.
Oh, sure. I was really fascinated, Jim, with your comparison of Charles Busch and Cole Escola. And I think, it's spot on, right? That there's been this explosion of mainstream drag culture that brings Cole into a different scale of cultural consciousness. But Cole is also very explicitly a non-binary person. They use they, them pronouns. And so not that, in today's world, would not Ethel Eichelberger have probably used they, them pronouns, right? That's not to say that this previous history is devoid of that. But I wonder when the histories that we have to frame contemporary practice are so binary. I wonder how the comparison to a cisgender man's drag career feels for someone like Cole. And I also wonder what we might learn about how a drag persona circulates when that drag persona is sort of pulled out from the historical binaries of gender that mainstream culture has sort of thought that it knew, so there's I think there is, again, not that previous drag artists haven't been very, very flamboyant in their physical presentations, right? But when Cole does go on mainstream television, when Cole goes to the Met Opera, right? Like, there's no outside of femme theatricality to Cole's gender presentation ever. And so I wonder how that refracts our historiographic sense of what drag is or has been for a mainstream audience.
I'm so sorry to cut off this fantastic conversation, and I wish that we had more time, but we are at time, and we want to thank everyone so much for being here, being a part of this. I hope it's a dialogue that continues. Let's stay in touch. Let's continue these conversations. So yes, congrats everyone. Thank you so much. And if you're going to ATHE in person, have a great conference, or if not, enjoy the rest of your summers. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Have a great summer.
Thank you, everyone.